Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about love. Alright, so there are a lot of misconceptions about love, and that's specifically why I'm making this video. So a lot of times people will think about love in terms of a particular emotion that you feel, or, if you're like, let's say, having a relationship with somebody, either a familial relationship or romantic or otherwise, maybe you could say that you love that person. So we often think about love in relation to that. And it's not that these two things don't have any relationship to love, because everything shares a relationship to love at its base level. But neither of these two things is love. So a lot of times people will think, oh, me having love is dependent on my emotions, or dependent upon the emotions that I feel when I'm around somebody else. And it leads people to believe that there is no love in their life because they don't have whatever relationship they feel like they need to have to their feelings or to other people to get that love, in a sense. But what love is actually more like a thing in itself. So the way I kind of think of it is that love is sort of a substance. Now I'm using the word substance very loosely here because it's not really a substance. But if you can imagine this will kind of give you the idea of what it is in terms of what I have experienced. So when I had my experiences of ego transcendence many years ago now, what I noticed is that love was really what everything was made out of. There wasn't anything that was separate from love. So it was almost as though I was tapping into this aspect of reality that I just hadn't been conscious of before, but that had always been there. And it came from a divine source. It was like really clear that that love was also God, and that it had always been the thing that, the word God had been referring to, even though at the time I only thought about God in relation to ideas of, oh, there's a guy in the clouds that does this and that and the other thing. But when I was in that experience, it was just really clear that love was like this almost base element to all of reality, and it was the connecting strand between all of reality. So if you can imagine, and again, this is not true, but I'm saying this just so you kind of get the feel of what it means. So imagine that, okay, so you have atoms, and then you have like strings and quarks and all of that stuff. Imagine that down below all of that, the smallest element that everything was made up of was divine love. And that every single thing at its base level was ultimately that substance. And then that substance had taken so many different forms that it looks like we're dealing with all kinds of different things, but really, at its core, what the base of the world is love. And so because at that point in time, I was resonating at the vibration of pure unconditional love, I was able to sort of tap into that reality that had always been there. It always was, and I knew that it always would be and always had been, but there was something that insulated me from that experience, and it was that I was not capable of resonating at the level of perfect divine love. But once I resonated at that level, it was like I clicked into place within that matrix of love, and it was like, oh, this has always been what it's been. Love is just what is. And so prior to that, I had always felt like I had to achieve this or that or the other thing to be deserving of love. And I never thought about it in those terms, but ultimately, practically, that's what I was doing. And I always felt like love was something that had to be earned, and my love was given very conditionally. Like there were people that I loved, and then there were people that maybe I loved a little bit less, and then people I didn't love at all, and and then of course I didn't think about reality itself as something deserving of love, because that's inanimate objects and all kinds of trees and all kinds of other stuff. So because I was able to sort of almost tap into what was most basic about my nature, what I was most made of, that divine perfect love, I was able to then experience that as a reality. And I felt this sense of oneness and connection with all things, and I was connected in love with all of those things. Now, as I said before, people most often relate love to the idea of it being a particular feeling state or a particular emotion that's sort of shared between two people. But again, this is not the right way to think about love, because that is just one manifestation of what happens within this matrix of love. And so the reason why I think it's associated with that is because these are really the areas of life where people are most, most likely to experience love, because I think it would be quite rare for someone to have an experience where they had let go to the point where they could resonate at the vibration of perfect divine love. And so what happens is that we just get little hits of it here and there, because ultimately our ability to be at that level is sort of distorted and comes through many different lenses. But it doesn't mean that none of it gets through, because it is so basic and elemental to the world. And so I think that when we have a particular relationship with someone and we can feel like we can let go and we can feel like we can be ourselves and that we're seen by that person, I think we end up being a little bit more open, and we end up actually being closer to that experience of divine love, and we experience that in association with that person. And then also, when we are experiencing that, particular emotions come up, and this is how we know that we are experiencing it. So because of this experience, and because of the fact that really ultimately the love was probably the most profound factor of having experienced ego transcendence, and really I felt completely at home in that love, because in a sense it was like within that matrix there was no way I could ever be extricated from that. There was no taking me out of that. It was so base to my nature that even in death, and even if everything changed, that would be the one thing that remained unchanged. It would always be love. So it was never a sense of it being conditional, in a sense. And I think a lot of people, might balk at this notion and, might get a little bit nervous. It's like, well, if it's perfect divine love, then why are there so many terrible things that happen? And why are there murders? And why are there wars and destruction and all kinds of different things going on that are awful? And so I would respond to that in a sense that love doesn't really work at the level of humane love. So whenever a human being is being loving and is experiencing those feelings of love, certain, altruistic kind of behaviors start to come up, where we become compassionate and we want to make sure that the best things happen, for the people and for the animals and for, all aspects of reality that we're trying to be compassionate for. But perfect divine love doesn't really work that way. That's really a more human expression of love, whereas perfect divine love is just accepting everything as it is, exactly as it is. And so, in a sense, it doesn't love any less terrible things than good things or neutral things. It doesn't have a hierarchical nature. It's very lateral. And in fact, if I were to describe my experience of that divine love, it was that it was a very equalizing factor. So it was like I had that experience, and then it was like all of a sudden everything had become very, very equal, in the sense that there was an equilibrium within that matrix of love. So within that matrix, I was no more or less lovable than a blade of grass. And I had perfect unconditional love for myself and a blade of grass infinitely. So it wasn't as though there was some kind of hierarchy of love, like, oh, I love these things more and I love these things less. It was very much different than that. And there was this sense of equilibrium that was reached there. So in that state, if I were to be watching, let's say, some terrible act of violence going on the humane level, I would be absolutely appalled. I would be feeling feelings of disgust, which would be playing out at full stretch. I would be able to say, I don't like that. I would be able to say that, oh, I want that to stop. But then in that aspect of myself that was resonating at divine love, it was just as much a valid aspect of reality as anything else. Everything was perfect within that state. Everything was heaven. And so there's a really sort of difficult paradox there to sort of reconcile if you ever get into that state and then come out of it, because then you're like, oh, how was I being accepting of all of those things while also not liking them at the same time, from a human level? And so ultimately, you'd have to see that your human emotions are also an aspect of that perfect divine love and are always doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And it was a really liberating experience to go through, because I had always had this sense that I wasn't really enough and that I had to be a certain somebody or do certain things to be worthy of love. But in that state, I loved myself perfectly. I loved myself infinitely. But I loved all things infinitely and perfectly. And so there was no distinction between myself and other things. And again, it was equalizing insofar as something that is infinite could be. So the idea of it being equal is not really the right word, because equal comes with a lot of associations of the same amount. But it didn't have to do with amounts, because anything that is infinite doesn't really have an amount. It just is. It's kind of in a sense like there is no real big and small, because you can ultimately you have to define big and small in relation to something, but this wasn't relational. This thing just was. And so it wasn't more loving or less loving. It was not possible to be more loving and less loving, because that wasn't an aspect of love's nature, of more and less. It wasn't an aspect of reality's nature. It just was, and it was all infinite, and it was all that there was. And as I said before, in that matrix of perfect divine love, there was no distortions. There was no more and less. It was perfectly lateral. So again, I love myself as much as I loved the daisy on the ground. Now, would I have sacrificed my love for a daisy on the ground? No, because I also had the human understanding that that's not really the way that things work, And I did have the relative understanding that, yes, human and animal life more important than plant life, and, ultimately, it would be really sad if a person were to perish. I had all of this stuff. I still had all of these types of almost selective compassions, but the love was a different thing. It was not compassion. It was not relationship. It was not feeling. It just what was. And I was resonating with what I was at my core base nature, which is love. So I want to talk about love in relation to fear for a bit, because fear is really the oppositional force to love. A lot of times you might have heard people say oh, love and fear are opposites. And, for me, that was strange to hear at first. I'm like, well, why would love and fear be opposite? Obviously, love and hate would be opposite. But at this base level, it is actually love and fear that are opposites, because fear creates resistance. And the resistance is what keeps you from being able to resonate at the level of perfect divine love. So again, because of this experience, I came to relate the experience of ego transcendence or enlightenment to the ability to resonate at the level of perfect divine love. But when it came to fear, when I was in that state, I was completely bereft of fear. But I'm not really sure which one came first. I don't know if I was able to resonate at the level of perfect love because I had no fear, or I had no fear because I was resonating at the level of perfect divine love. Now, I'm inclined to believe that it was the former, where essentially I let go of fear, and then it was very, very clear where the love was, because I didn't have that resistance to it, and all of it just sort of flowed into my experience quite naturally. But I do know that there is a relationship between the two. So the presence of fear, because when I was in the perspective of ego, just as I am now, essentially the thing that was keeping me identified with that ego was fear of letting go of it, fear of undermining that identity. And so in a sense, I had to sort of edit things out of my reality. I had to be very conditionally loving to keep that ego and that identity going, because I had to like certain things more than I liked other things. I had to see certain things as valid and other things as not valid. I had to create this whole arbitrary system of values where it's like, oh, well, these are the ones that I want to abide by and to have as part of my identity, and all the rest I'm going to ignore about myself. So it was that process of trying to ignore aspects of myself and aspects of reality that created that distortion in that, so where I couldn't really resonate at the level of perfect divine love. But once I let go of ego, or maybe ego came as a letting go of ego came as a response to resonating at perfect love, essentially I was open enough to experience love. So to explain how divine love is, I want to kind of give you an imperfect analogy here. So, and I say it's imperfect because it doesn't quite work, but I think you might get the gist of what it means. So basically, imagine that you yourself are a balloon, and your sense of identity is the fact that that balloon is kind of a closed system, that it has the balloon skin on the outside and the air inside of the balloon is kept together. And so essentially what you really are is the air inside of the balloon. You know, you're not the balloon skin, that's just the identity that's kind of keeping it to where that air stays separate from the air around you. And so you're relating yourself back to that balloon skin. So again, that's the rubber on the outside of the balloon, and the rubber on the outside of the balloon would symbolize fear and ego. Those things are the thing that keeps the air in the balloon from getting out. Now imagine that that balloon were in this infinite space that's filled with air. And I use air because air is a gas, and as a gas it completely, perfectly, evenly fills the space, just like perfect divine love. So imagine that in this metaphor, the air inside of the balloon and the air outside of the balloon is perfect divine love. But because you are relating yourself to the balloon skin and the fear that keeps that balloon together as one individual entity, ultimately the air on the inside of the balloon, that is perfect divine love, doesn't get a connection to the air outside of the balloon that is perfect divine love. And so there is a sense of disconnection and a sense of isolation. And there's a distortion in that field of perfect divine love. And so you can't resonate quite at that level of it. But if someone comes along and pops that balloon, in a sense this would represent ego transcendence and letting go of fear, letting it drop away. And essentially what you have at that point is you have the air inside of the balloon and the air outside of the balloon really just becoming this whole evenly spread field of air that is perfect divine love. And this is a lot what I experienced when my ego had dropped away during those experiences. Was I had this sense of, oh, I'm separate, and then that balloon got popped, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it was only always ever one huge, evenly spread field of divine love, and I'm experiencing it now. And I feel at home in it. There's no extricating me as an individual from this. It will always be the case. So thinking of divine love as a gaseous substance that really fills the entire area. Again, it's not a perfect metaphor, but you get kind of the idea of how it works. It's very evenly spread. And it's also something that just is. It's not something that, you need a certain feeling or a certain relationship to achieve. It's already there. But the reason why this metaphor is not perfect is because the balloon skin and the fear and the ego that go together to create that is also an aspect of perfect divine love, because everything comes from that. Even though the ego is an illusion and fear creates resistance, ultimately you would not want to resist those things, because that shows that you are unconditionally loving, and you cannot resonate at the level of perfect divine love if you think that ego and fear are somehow separate from perfect divine love. So it becomes very difficult to talk about this in a way that people can understand, is because it doesn't work intuitively the way that people might assume that it would. But once you have an experience of it, it's really quite clear you know, just how grounded you are within that perfect divine love, because it's just what is, and you are an aspect of what is, and so there's nothing that disconnects you from that. And once you tap into that aspect of self, you feel connected with absolutely everything, because nothing is outside of that system. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe. Also, share this video with a friend if you found it to be helpful. I also wanted to say thank you so much to my patrons for keeping me motivated to make a video every week. And if you're interested in becoming my patron in exchange for rewards, I'll leave a link down below in the description box. Also, I have, I think, about 7 more spots open for life coaching for next month. So if you're interested in life coaching sessions, also check out my Patreon page. I have information on there about it. Essentially, these are one-on-one sessions through Skype. And you can have the option of either doing 1 session per month or 2 sessions per month. And it'll be an ongoing thing for as long as I do this this program. Ultimately, I'm looking to become certified as a life coach, but until then, I want to get as much practice in as possible, and so I'm offering it for a cheaper price. And so again, if that's something that you're interested in, you can either leave me a comment down below and ask, or you can actually check out my Patreon page, and I have information about it there. And also make sure you click the little notification bell to get notifications of when I release a video every week. Or you can go to thediamondnet.org and you can fill out your name and your email address, and I'll send out 1 email per week to let you know when I've released a video. Anyway, that's all I have for now. Until next time, keep becoming more you.